Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and tonight is a special night because this is going to be a debate. And we've only done a few of those on Trinity Radio, but I'm so excited. And I'm excited for the people that are going to be here with me debating this issue. On your left, you see David Pallmann. Some of you may recall that he was just an interview on our episode just this past week, and is a student at the school that I'm at, and just a bibliophile and debating beast on theological issues and on philosophical issues that come up in the world of apologetics. And so I'm excited to have him back. David, welcome to the show. And over here we have Godless Engineer, John Gleason. And Godless Engineer was one of the first atheist response videos I ever made was to Godless Engineer. And he reached out to me in the chat. And we've had I think a friendly adversarial relationship since then. And I'm so glad that you're here with us. John, welcome to the show. Guys, thanks for showing up today.
Thanks for having me back.
I kind of left it where you both have to talk at the same time, didn't I?
Yeah.
But I am really glad to have you guys here. John, do you feel like you're a lion among the lambs or something here? How do you feel?
I mean, I do kind of feel like Daniel in the lion's den. Yeah. I mean, but I mean, I'm perfectly fine with that. And, I'm glad to be here on Trinity Radio because, I catch, your live shows on occasion. I know, who's your co-host there, Braxton?
Jonathan Pritchett.
Jonathan Pritchett, he definitely likes me because whenever I remember one time when y'all responded to one of my videos or y'all were talking about one of my videos, he got up really close in the camera and was like, "What's up, y'all?" And it was really funny.
He does do that every time. David, you feeling good tonight?
I am doing well. I just hope I don't let everyone down after that build-up you gave me at the beginning there.
We're all hoping that too, David, but let's get right into it. And so, no, I know you guys are both going to do a good job. Let's get into it, and we'll do some Q&A at the end. What's going to happen tonight is we're going to have 12-minute opening statements from David and then from Godless Engineer. And then after that, we're going to move into 45 minutes of open discussion. Very informal, but I'll be around in the background. And then after that, we'll get to your questions. They'll have a brief time to make some closing statements. We'll get to your questions, though. So go ahead and be submitting those. I'll be watching for those. But I'm excited about this. We're going to talk about, did Jesus rise bodily from the dead? And hopefully we can get to an answer about that tonight. I'm ready to get to an answer about that. So I'm going to open with the person making the affirmative statement here, and that's David Pallmann. So David, we'll go to your PowerPoint, and your time will start when you speak.
Awesome. All right. So in this debate, I am defending the proposition that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, and will be granting or assuming the existence of Jesus for the purposes of this debate. This doctrine is the linchpin upon which the entire Christian faith depends, and as such, it merits careful attention from both Christians and skeptics of the faith alike. Next slide. I will use 4 ancient sources which testify to Jesus' resurrection to make my case: the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If we have good reasons to believe that these sources, or if we have good reasons to believe these sources, then we have good reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Next slide. Before digging into the specifics, I think it'll be helpful if I give a broad overview of the argument which I'll be defending. So premise 1, there is testimony saying that Jesus was resurrected. Premise 2, this testimony comes from credible sources. Premise 3, there are only 3 logical possibilities with respect to credible testimony. Either it is true, it's deliberately false, or it's honestly mistaken. Premise 4, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not deliberately false. Premise 5, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not honestly mistaken. Premise 6, therefore the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true. Premise 7, if the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true, then Jesus was resurrected. Conclusion, therefore Jesus was resurrected. Now I take 1 and 3 to be fairly uncontroversial, and 6 simply follows from 1 through 5. 7 is true by definition, and 8 follows from 6 and 7. So I think that the most controversial premises in this argument are 2, 4, and 5. Consequently, I'll spend most of my opening defending them. So let's begin with that second premise. I'll be defining the term credible sources technically. I understand this to be a source from someone who's in a good position to know if some event happened by either witnessing it or hearing about it directly from someone who did. The importance of this premise is that it disallows the skeptic from positing that the Gospels come to us at the end of a long, evolving, ever more legendary oral tradition. If the Gospels come to us directly from eyewitnesses or their immediate followers, then this forces the skeptic into the trilemma stated in the third premise. Inasmuch as I fully expect this to be the most controversial premise in this debate, I'm going to dedicate quite a bit of space to defending this proposition that our four Gospels are indeed written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Next slide. Perhaps the most obvious evidence for the traditional authorship comes from the very titles which these documents unanimously have in virtually all extant copies where a title is present. Without exception, they are titled as the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. While my opponent has said in the past the Gospels were written anonymously and didn't have their current titles until much later, there is in fact no evidence to support this claim. We possess no anonymous copies, and this theory is implausible since as soon as more than one Gospel was written, the early Christians would need some way to tell them apart. Next slide. As Dr. Brant Petrie says, to suggest that no titles whatsoever were added to the Gospels until the late 2nd century AD completely fails to take into account the fact that multiple Gospels were already circulating before Luke ever set pen to papyrus, and that there would be a practical need to identify these books. Next slide. This point is felt even more sharply when we compare the Gospels to the truly anonymous book of Hebrews, which, in various manuscripts and ancient sources, we find attributed to no one, to Paul, to Timothy, and to Luke. Hebrews provides a test case of what we should expect a genuinely anonymous source to look like. We possess anonymous copies and find disagreement over the authorship. This is not the case when it comes to the Gospels. Despite these considerations, it might be objected that the authors of the Gospels do not identify themselves within the text. This much is true, but the Gospels are not unique in this regard. Many ancient historians do not identify themselves within their own writings, but are only known through external sources. Tacitus and Plutarch are prominent examples. And in the case of the Gospels, we have strong external attestation to their authorship. Next slide. So Matthew's identified as the author which bears his name by Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. John is identified as the author of the Gospel which bears his name by Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. Luke is identified as the author of the Gospel which bears his name by Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. Mark is identified as the author of the Gospel which bears his name by possibly Papias, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen. Mark is almost always identified as having the Apostle Peter as his source. Now, there's much more attestation to the traditional authorship which I could bring forward, but it's either from anonymous sources or 3rd century or later. And in any case, I think that we got enough testimony here to make a strong case for the traditional authorship. Next slide. It cannot be overstated that these men were spread over a wide geographical space, making it unlikely that they're all pulling from a common source. Their independence is further seen in the fact that there are some apparent contradictions between them with respect to when the Gospels were written and possibly the order in which they were written. Some explanation is needed for the unanimous voice with which the ancient church names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the author of these Gospels. I propose that the best explanation is that they were telling the truth. These sources are also very close to the writing of the Gospels by people who would have likely known the apostles themselves or those who did. Papias is especially important because his testimony dates to the early 2nd century at the latest, and possibly as early as the 1st century. Papias himself tells us that he was careful in how he got his information, that he inquired into the teachings of the apostles in particular. Moreover, he probably knew the apostle John, and therefore would have been ideally placed to know if John wrote the gospel which is attributed to him. Next slide. Monty Shanks says, 12 different fragments from 10 different authors claimed that Papias had, to some degree, personally known the Apostle John. It is recognized that some of these authors depended upon others for their knowledge of Papias' connection to the Apostle. Nevertheless, some of the more credible witnesses of the Apostle John's mentoring of Papias are Irenaeus, Eusebius, Jerome, and Anastasius of Sinai. The only person that questioned Papias' association with the Apostle was Eusebius, who later in his life unashamedly and unjustifiably displayed gross prejudice towards Papias. I also want to draw attention to Justin Martyr, who is an early source and whose reference to the gospel provides indirect support for the traditional authorship. For although he does not mention the author of the Gospels by name, he says that they were delivered to the Christians by Jesus' apostles and their followers. Next slide. C.E. Hill points out that Justin's use of the plurals here would seem to mean that he acknowledged at least 4 Gospels, at least 2 written by apostles, and at least 2 by followers of the apostles. This matches up well with the hypothesis of traditional authorship, since Matthew and John would have been apostles, and Mark and Luke would have been followers of Peter and Paul. In passing, it's worth noting that there seems to be very little motivation for inventing Mark and Luke as the authors of these Gospels, because neither of them would have been an eyewitness, and neither of them was particularly prominent in the early church. Next slide. Craig Blomberg argues, it is hard to believe that the oldest traditions would uniformly associate the first 2 Gospels with Mark and Luke without some good historical reason, because neither was otherwise viewed as a significant figure in first century Christianity. Indeed, Mark in particular was known for abandoning Paul on one of his missionary journeys. Matthew, whose gospel was the most Jewish in style, would also be an odd choice to invent as being the author. This is because Matthew is identified as a tax collector for the Romans within the gospel, and the Jews were not fond of these individuals. So it would be strange and counterproductive to invent him as being the author of a gospel which is directed towards a predominantly Jewish audience. This evidence is all easily explained if we posit that the Synoptic Gospels are attributed to Matthew, Mark, and Luke because these men really were the authors. It's very difficult to imagine why these names were selected if they did not belong to the authors of these documents. Next slide. In sum, we have every reason for believing that the Gospels come either firsthand or secondhand from those who were in a good position to know what they were talking about. All of the available evidence supports the traditional authorship of these documents. All of these sources attest to the resurrection of Jesus. So when credible sources give us information, we have but 3 options. The information is true, it's deliberately false, or it's honestly mistaken. I'll now seek to show that the testimony bearing on the resurrection is not plausibly deliberately false, nor is it plausibly honestly mistaken. Next slide. Against the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were deliberately lying, I will urge 2 points. First, it seems that they had nothing to gain by lying about this. There is no obvious benefit to be gained by deliberately misleading people into believing that Jesus had been resurrected. Second, there appears to be every reason not to lie about something like this. We know that the early Christians faced intense persecution at the hands of the Romans. We know this both from the early Christian literature, such as Paul's letters, Acts, Hebrews, and Clement, as well as from secular writings from the time, such as the Roman historian Tacitus. We know that, generally speaking, one of the strongest human desires is self-preservation. So if the disciples really believed that Jesus was resurrected and that this ensured them eternal life, then their willingness to die for this belief is easy to explain. On the other hand, if they were deliberately lying, it's very hard to explain their willingness to die. Just on balance, the evidence is strongly opposed to the idea that the witness to the resurrection is a lie. Next slide. So if they weren't lying, then perhaps they were just honestly mistaken. It's a bit trickier to argue against this point since a more detailed account is needed to explain precisely how the disciples were mistaken. But here I'm going to focus on the most popular class of such explanations, which posit that the disciples were honestly mistaken as a result of purely psychological factors, such as expectation, hallucination, groupthink, cognitive dissonance, or grief. Against this thesis that the disciples were honestly mistaken on purely psychological grounds, I urge 2 points. First, the empty tomb. To the extent that we are going to posit that the disciples were honestly mistaken, then we must accept that they at least genuinely believed their own reports contained in the Gospels. This means that we would have to accept their witness to the fact that Jesus' tomb was really empty. This physical evidence can't be explained by a purely psychological hypothesis. Of course, one could add the additional hypothesis that Jesus' body was stolen by some third party, but that increases the complexity of the hypothesis and lowers its intrinsic probability. The resurrection hypothesis provides a single and unified explanation of both the empty tomb and the disciples' genuine belief in the resurrection. Second, the details and multiplicity of witnesses to the resurrection make purely psychological explanations of the disciples' genuine belief in the resurrection unlikely. In John, for example, we have reports that Jesus cooked fish for the disciples. It's strange credulity to think that they all sort of made this up, or that they all had the same hallucination, or that they all agreed on something this specific as the result of a groupthink. Moreover, one could also bring up One could also bring up the fact that the Apostle Paul's belief couldn't be explained via grief, since he initially demonstrated hostility towards Christianity. In short, there just isn't a good explanation for how genuine but false belief in the resurrection might have arisen. So if we conclude that the witnesses to the final slide. So if we conclude that the witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus are not lying and are not honestly mistaken, we have one option left. They were telling the truth. And if they were telling the truth, then this entails that Jesus was indeed resurrected from the dead. Consequently, I answer the debate question affirmatively. Yes, Jesus rose from the dead bodily.
All right. Thanks so much, David and John, that he came in at 10 seconds over time. So if you want to take 10 seconds over time, you go right ahead. But that was pretty good. And so, John, we'll just go straight into yours if you're ready, and we'll start when you speak. Oh, you might be muted, John. John.
Much.
There you go.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Start now.
All right. So yes, today I am here to discuss why I think that Jesus bodily resurrected. There are a number of nuances to this. Sorry, next slide. I'll get used to that. There are certain nuances to this topic. Specifically, there are two aspects I want to analyze. There is a mere belief in a bodily resurrection, then there is an actual bodily resurrection. The difference between these two is quite simple. A mere belief in the bodily resurrection doesn't have to be based in reality. It also only needs evidence that this belief arose, which is much easier to prove. An actual bodily resurrection requires real historical evidence to argue for it. I don't believe this actually happened, given the evidence that we have. For the sake of this discussion, though, we're assuming that Jesus existed in history, so you can put down your pitchforks right now about that particular topic. Next slide. So my case against the bodily resurrection analyzes three areas of the evidence. First, the prior likelihood of the resurrection. This will answer the questions of how likely resurrection is in the first place and how likely a belief in the resurrection would be to develop. Next, the Pauline evidence for the resurrection. Paul is our earliest recorded evidence of Jesus, and how we know and how he knows about Jesus is vital to understanding how Jews thought about Jesus. Finally, we look at the gospel evidence. This will be the lightest section because I don't think the gospels are all that reliable, but I'll explain that a bit later. Next slide. So first up is the prior likelihood of the resurrection. Next slide. Okay, so first, let's look at the prior likelihood for an actual bodily resurrection. There have been no other individuals or specifically savior figures to bodily resurrect. Other figures thought to have resurrected did not actually resurrect and most likely never were historical figures in the first place. These figures would include Inanna, Zalmoxis, Dionysus, Romulus, Osiris, and many more. All these figures were said to have bodily resurrected. A resurrected Romulus was said to have been seen by one of his closest friends on their way between cities. As for Osiris, Plutarch discusses how he bodily resurrected and returned back to Earth. Jesus seems to fit right in with this set of dying and rising gods, and if that is the case, then Jesus being the only one to actually resurrect is extremely unlikely. That doesn't prove that he didn't, just that you would need strong evidence to overcome this fact. Next, the resurrection requires reality to operate fundamentally differently. In general, people do not bodily resurrect like this. We aren't talking about resuscitation, but being dead for extended periods of time and then coming back to life. The bodily resurrection of anyone would require a suspension of reality for it to happen. The physics of reality would have to momentarily change in order for a resurrection to occur. Considering all this, Jesus' resurrection would be the single time in all of history that this event occurred. Again, this doesn't mean that it's impossible for Jesus to have resurrected. It just means it's extremely unlikely to have happened. Now, what about the likelihood of the mere belief arising? Well, for one thing, the Jews were accustomed to resurrections in their faith. We don't count these as actual resurrections like in the previous section because we don't have any evidence that these resurrections occurred except for the claims of the Old Testament. The books in which these resurrections appear are most likely not historical accounts. There are 3 resurrections the Jews would have known about: the widow's son in Zarephath, that's 1 Kings 17, 17 to 22. The Shunammite's son, 2 Kings 4:18 to 37, and the man thrown into Elisha's grave, 2 Kings 13:20. So it's likely that the resurrection would have been easily accepted into popular belief. Next slide. So next, in the prior likelihood of mere belief, some Jews were definitely expecting a disgraced, dying, and resurrecting Messiah. Isaiah 49:7, Psalms 89:38 to 95, the suffering servant of Isaiah 52:53, Daniel 9, Psalm 22, the wisdom of Solomon 2:12 to 22, 5:1 through 8, 5:15 to 23 are all references to this in Scripture. If we look at Isaiah 49:7, we read, "This is what the Lord says, the Redeemer and Holy One of Israel, to him who was despised and abhorred by the nation, to the servant of rulers. Kings will see you and stand up, princes will see you and bow down because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you." The rest of the passages communicate similar messages. This is actually a known thing in scholarship. Jason A. Staples, in his dissertation that he reworked into a book called The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, says this: the oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying anointed one or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism is therefore mistaken, to which Jason then cites 2 other biblical scholars who came to the same conclusions. It's completely unreasonable to say that no Jews were expecting the exact kind of Messiah that Jesus would eventually become. This greatly increases the likelihood that the mere belief would eventually arise. Furthermore, Paul seems to indicate that he identified this exact idea was already in the Scriptures to begin with. 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 4, Romans 4:23 through 25, Philemon 2:5 through 11 all indicate this notion. If we look at 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 4, we read, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures." The according to the Scriptures part seems to indicate that this idea is found in Scriptures, and furthermore, that is where Paul learned about it. Some translations have "in accordance with," but this is an attempt to indicate fulfilled prophecy. Paul mentions the Scriptures so much because the Scriptures are one of the primary sources for Paul. The Talmud can also give us insight into what Jews would accept about the Messiah. The Talmud contains a messianic interpretation of Isaiah 52 to 53, the suffering servant passages. While the Talmud is dated much later, between the 4th and 6th century, it's unreasonable to think that the Jews would invent a tradition that only seems to validate Christianity or Christian interpretation of the Scriptures. If it did arise after Christianity, we would similarly expect an apologetic against Christians, but we don't find that. Next slide, please. Finally, on the prior probability, we have the book of Daniel. We've already mentioned this earlier as to having passages that allude to the Messiah, but it also contains a timeline that would roughly place the Messiah as coming around the 30s AD. This prepared some of the Jews to construct a belief in the suffering, disgraced, dying, and resurrecting Messiah in the 30s AD. If they were prepped for this belief, all it would take is just claiming that this had happened in one way or another for people to accept it, which coincidentally would be what Peter started, as well as other apostles, including Paul. Considering all this, it's highly likely that a mere belief in a dying and rising Savior would develop in the Jewish community. Next slide. So next we're going to go over the Pauline evidence for the resurrection. First thing to consider with Paul's evidence is that he was a diaspora Jew. This means that he was not in a Jewish echo chamber. He ends up getting exposed to several different cultures. He began syncretizing these Hellenistic ideas with the Jewish religion, along with other Jews at the time, like Philo of Alexandria. Paul wrote in Koine Greek, which meant that he had to learn it at pagan schools. That means that Paul would have been exposed to those pagan traditions that we mentioned earlier, specifically the dying and rising gods we mentioned. Now, what did Paul think about Christ's resurrection? I do think that Paul considered Jesus to be bodily resurrected, primarily because Jews considered the heavens, hell, and angelic figures to be physical places and people. They thought of those angelic figures as real physical beings, just as they just had the ability to live in the celestial realm too. This doesn't mean that I think Jesus actually bodily resurrected, just that Paul believed that he was bodily resurrected, mainly because Paul only experienced Jesus through visions or hallucinations, however you want to characterize that, and reading the scriptures. Galatians 1:11 through 16, Romans 10:14 to 17, 1 Corinthians 9:1, 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 15, Romans 16:25 to 26, all indicate this. Most notably, Galatians 1:11 through 16 says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in my Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. And so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult anyone." As you can see, Paul emphasizes that he didn't get his information from any historically existing person or eyewitness. He only trusted information either revealed to him by Jesus or he read from the scriptures. In Galatians 2, Paul establishes that the gospel he mined from the scriptures and his visions was the same information that other apostles were spreading. So Paul was teaching the same stuff that Peter, was teaching the same stuff that Peter and what would become the church was teaching about Jesus. Paul seems to only believe in the resurrection because he had revelations and read about it in the scriptures. Next slide. Yep. So Paul's evidence has us asking these questions. If Jesus had actually bodily resurrected, why infer information about it from scriptures? Why not just refer to eyewitnesses? Why did Paul separate himself from any historical source? Why didn't Paul ever reference the disciples instead of only apostles? Historical events we know happened have sources, and authors documented these events never seem to distance themselves from those sources. Next slide. Yep. Gospel evidence.
About 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
But you can take a minute. Take a minute. Take a minute, John.
Okay. Take a minute. Okay. The gospel evidence is some of the least convincing evidence that you can present. The Gospel of Mark is really the only piece of evidence that you can include in the section because it's the only pseudo-independent evidence in the group. I call it pseudo-independent because Mark draws upon Paul's epistles for some of his gospel. There are certain things that Mark has Jesus arguing for that Paul described as being his personal opinion and not a command from the Lord. So Mark is definitely influenced by Paul, thus making it not truly independent. We know for a fact that other gospels are based on Mark's gospel, either directly or indirectly. The biggest problem with the gospels is the fact that they only ever cite scriptures as their evidence for the information they record. Paul does this too, which seems to indicate that either there were no eyewitness accounts of the resurrected Jesus or eyewitness accounts had little value. This is a big problem for the actual bodily resurrection of Christ. If we don't have any eyewitness accounts of his happening and only scriptural interpretation, that makes it far less likely that he was actually bodily resurrected. We only know that the Gospels used Mark because of textual evidence that connects all Gospels together. If these were eyewitness accounts, they wouldn't need to copy off one another. If they were based on eyewitness accounts, then they, again, would need to copy from one another. Scripture. We also cannot distinguish between historical fact and fiction in these accounts if any fact actually exists. There are many reasons to reject the Gospels as historical accounts. Reasons like the lack of internally analyzing and addressing contradictions in the traditions, presence of the author and the work, the education level of the target audience, genre differences, authorial speculation, lesser degree of authorial license, interdependence between the Gospels, miracles being the central to the story instead of at the fringe, and important events and people immediately disappear from the story. The Oxford Annotated Bible states neither the evangelists nor their first readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm the Christian faith, and they cite Luke 1:4 and John 20:31. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They thus do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. The Gospels don't provide good historical information as an end cap. I do have a summary of my case, but I guess I can just leave it at that.
Go ahead, John. Just go ahead and get it all out there. Let's get it all out on the table.
Just go on ahead. Okay. All right. So, in summary of my case, Jesus most likely didn't bodily resurrect as the current evidence stands. The prior probability is too low to overcome the underwhelming evidence that exists. Many factors contribute to this low probability. The Jews were actively reinterpreting scriptures for information about the Messiah in the first century. Different groups of Jews came to similar conclusions about the Messiah, specifically the Orthodox Jews coming to a two-savior idea and Paul's sect imagining one savior, both determining that the suffering servant from Isaiah was messianic. This shows that there was a pre-Christian idea that the Jewish Messiah would be disgraced, suffer, die, and resurrect. Ultimately, the evidence for the resurrection is just not good. Paul never cites a historical source for Jesus' resurrection and even emphasizes how he didn't use any historical sources. And the Gospels can't give us any good historical information because we can't determine what is historical fact from fiction, so they are useless to a historical case for the resurrection. As we can see, Jesus' resurrection was a mere belief and not a historical event. And that will conclude my case.
All right, guys. Thanks for getting it all out on the table for us. And at this point, what we'll do is we'll go into about 45 minutes of open dialogue. I'll pop in if it's absolutely necessary, but I think one of the cool things about this is just the back and forth that we're going to have. And so I'm going to go to that window now, and you guys can just feel free to start. Maybe, I don't know, Pallmann, do you want to come back on anything or to start out with, maybe get the ball rolling?
Sure, yeah. So could I maybe ask why you think that the Gospels are not independent sources?
Oh, yeah, sure. So it's been shown in scholarship that, that Mark was written first, and then Matthew, used Mark in order to generate his gospel. And then Luke seems to have used both Matthew and Mark to write his gospel. I don't subscribe to the Q document idea. I don't know if you do, but I generally try not to just ad hoc fabricate sources just because it makes something easier or something like that. So I go with the I don't know what I can't remember the name of the model that it is, but basically
fair hypothesis.
Fair. That's right. That's the word. That one. But also, it's also been shown that John also had access to all three of the Gospels. So pretty much Mark was written first, and then all of the subsequent Gospels used Mark in some fashion to create their Gospels.
How has that been shown?
Well, but because it's quite simply the simplest answer, like the simplest conclusion to come to, and by that I mean it's got the least amount of ad hoc assumptions attached to it. For instance, the verbatim phrases and sentences and sections that appear in both Matthew and Luke. The fact that Luke prefers to use Matthew over Mark shows that Luke used Matthew in order to create his account as well. But I mean, pretty much it's the verbatim, passages in there that, are across all the Gospels that it's commonly called, the synoptic problem. how to solve that and everything.
I agree that we have verbatim agreement in all three synoptic gospels. The question is why think that the dependency begins with Mark, because verbatim agreement could be interpreted multiple different ways. You could also interpret this verbatim agreement as any one of the gospels, any one of the synoptics being written first, and then the other ones pulling from that. I don't know why you think that Mark is the first one to be written.
Well, generally, the reason why we say that Mark was the first one to be written is because of allusions to the Jerusalem temple being destroyed in 70 A.D. So we kind of place it at that point, but also because of the fact that it's the shortest gospel and the one that's written with Jesus being, I guess, closer to like an adoptionist kind of mindset. Whereas we find throughout the other gospels, you have an ever increasing like Christology going on. So like Mark has sort of an adoptionist view of Jesus. And then you got Matthew and Luke. Matthew being written first, reworks that and makes Jesus a little bit more powerful, a little bit more, he can do more, more powerful things. And then Luke also, he corrects some things about Matthew and his gospel that, Luke feels like Matthew gets wrong. And so, I mean, it's just the general progression of it and how the verbatim copies seem to line up is how we place the gospels where they are.
Do you think that Paul held a high Christology?
I think Paul thought that, I've always had one particular idea of what it means to have a high Christology. Because what I think that Paul thought was that Jesus was separate from God, and that Jesus was a different being from God, and but that Jesus, when Jesus appeared to Paul, he was a divine or celestial figure at that point. So, and okay. I'm not trying to throw any kind of mythicist ideas in here. I'm just saying that when Jesus appeared to Paul, he was a physical celestial like figure, because that's how they viewed the celestial realm at that point. It was a physical place, and so it was inhabited by physical beings. And Jesus being a celestial figure, he would have been a physical being.
So my point here, though, is that if we accept that Paul holds a relatively high Christology, that seems to cast doubt on this evolutionary idea in the Gospels, that we could say, okay, so this idea of a high Christology evolves over time, so therefore we can say that Mark is first on the basis of his supposedly having a low Christology, and then we can see that this like incrementally grows over time. If we agree with Richard Bauckham that we can find high Christology in Paul, and so that the highest Christology is essentially the earliest Christology, then I don't think that there can be an evolutionary argument based on Christology, assuming for the sake of argument that Mark has a lower Christology. I don't think that there can be an argument there that Mark is first. Sorry,
David. That seems rather arbitrary. That seems rather arbitrary and ad hoc. I mean, because it just, you saying, that means that Mark can't have this low Christology. I don't see any reason why Mark can't have a low Christology. But regardless of all that,
I wasn't saying Mark couldn't have a low Christology. I was just saying that even granting for the sake of argument that he does, if we can find a high Christology in Paul, who I think we both agree predates Mark, then that's going to undercut the argument for saying that Mark is first based on his allegedly having a low Christology, because you can't make the argument that, well, look, high Christology evolved over time if we can find high Christology in Paul. That's the point.
Okay, well, I feel like all of this is, regardless of all of this, it still doesn't mean that the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts. Okay. I mean, I feel like however you want to order the Gospels, I really feel like it doesn't really matter to the actual evidence. I feel like the evidence of the Gospels is that, for one thing, I know that you disagree with is that they're anonymously written, but also the fact that they don't cite any historical sources. They are totally different from other historical, writings at the time. there's a lot of things about the Gospels that scream like fabrication, or at least sort of like a mythic telling of something. And this is due to just how historians analyze texts like this. A lot from this particular section of my presentation, I get a lot of it from Matthew Ferguson. He wrote a great write-up on why historians consider the Gospels to be anonymously written and not based on any kind of like historical idea, as far as them being eyewitness accounts and things of that nature. And so, I mean, there's just all the hallmarks of fabricated accounts rather than historical accounts. So if there is any historical facts contained within the Gospels, which I totally agree that it's possible for them to contain some historical ideas or facts, I don't think that you can actually have a good methodology for sorting out which is which. I think that any methodology you could come up with, you can easily counter with, any number of reasons as to why that doesn't necessarily mean that this particular portion is historical.
Okay, so in my view, Matthew is going to be the first gospel written. And in my view, it's written by the Apostle Matthew. So I'm not really seeing a need for him to cite sources because he himself is going to be the source of the majority of the information in his gospel. It's not like
he never names himself in the gospel.
Well, I mean, he does if we take the account of the calling of himself, the calling of Matthew, if he's being, or are you saying he doesn't name himself as the author?
Well, not just that, but he also doesn't speak as if he's part of this group, or that he's a follower of Jesus or anything like that. He speaks from like the entire Gospel of Matthew is spoken from this third person kind of view. He says they did this and they did that. He never like speaks from like a first person kind of view, like we would expect some kind of eyewitness or historical account. Unless you're suggesting that. Oh, go ahead.
I think that's a little bit anachronistic because we know that people did write history in the third person back then. I mean, Julius Caesar, the conquest of Gaul, it's entirely written in the third person, but I don't know of anyone who questions that Julius Caesar wrote the conquest of Gaul. So, I mean, this is just, I think that this is an anachronistic objection.
I don't think that it's anachronistic at all, primarily because that's not the only reason why we think that it is like if that was the only reason why we thought that Matthew didn't write the Gospel of Matthew, then I could see an argument being made for that. But that's not the only reason why. I mean, the fact that Matthew never claims authorship within the gospel is very clear. And I know that you ascribe to the whole titles affixed to the gospels as being always there, but we actually don't have any evidence of that.
We don't have any evidence that they ever weren't. As far as we know, they always had.
That's just an argument from silence, though, like a weak argument from silence, not a strong one. Having the titles affixed to the Gospels from the beginning doesn't explain why the gospel, like between one gospel to another gospel, like one version of Matthew to another version of Matthew, the story is pretty much stays the same. Of course, there can be changes or whatnot in between there, but the actual titles, we have records of the titles actually being titled differently, not like they credit somebody else with it, but just the titles are formed differently on each one, which seems to suggest that these titles were only affixed later on, and they're not as solid as the actual gospel itself. So every piece of evidence seems to point to the fact that the gospels were originally written anonymously, but more than that, each gospel was written to correct the previous gospels. So there would be no need for titles or anything like that. It would just be the gospel of Jesus, which is actually what I believe each gospel starts out with, right?
So I have 2 points on that, and you can respond to each of them or just one if you want. But on the first point you brought up there, saying that they are they are always attributed to these individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even if it's not always the gospel according to Matthew, right?
Well, not until the second century.
Well, as far as we can tell from these manuscripts, from every manuscript we have that has a title, with one possible exception for the Gospel of Matthew, but virtually every manuscript that has a title, it's attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, even if it's
from the second
disagreeing
century.
Well, so this, I think, is going to go back to the point I raised from Petrie, which is as soon as you had more than one gospel, you're going to need a way to tell them apart. So as far as we can tell, there was never a time when they didn't have these titles. So you think that, okay, well, then what would you say to Petrie on that point?
Well, I mean, I would say that assumes that there's this monolithic Christian group in the first century, don't you think? Like there's a monolithic. No. Then so the alternative is that there were several different Christian groups. Each Christian group would have their own gospel according to Jesus. And we have several different stories that were not incorporated into the canon that are part of these various different Christian communities in the first century. Of course, we only have records of the ones that won out, being the Pauline version of it. There are some other versions of the Christian faith that exist that have different interpretations of things. Like I believe Eastern Orthodox Christianity is a little bit different. They interpret things maybe a little bit differently. But basically, you had all of these different groups, and so all of these groups they would have their own respective gospel traditions. They would have the gospel of Jesus, and so these individual groups, it's not like they had these multiple versions of the gospels. They just had the gospel. And it wasn't until I believe Papias is the first one to ever mention multiple gospels even existing or being accepted by the Christian community. And he just sort of arbitrarily labels them. He even gets Matthew completely wrong, because he says that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, but from all indications, textually and physical evidence, or textual evidence, everything like that, that couldn't be the case. So there was no Hebrew Matthew to originally exist. So that's maybe that's another different gospel that was out there or something like that. But we know that that's not the Matthew that we have. We have a completely different Matthew than Papias ascribes. And I mean, most biblical scholars would say that, Papias is probably the least trustworthy church father that you could cite for this particular section. But as far as to what I would say to that one guy is that, each community had their own gospels, their own gospel, and that it didn't occur until later that the need to separate which gospel are we talking, which gospel's which. It wasn't until the Christian community started to become more monolithic that was necessary.
All right, I got several thoughts on that. So first of all, this point of having multiple communities, you still need a way to identify the different gospels. I mean, we know this from second century when you have disputes over these other gospels. They all have names.
David, I feel like
gospel. I'm just saying that there were ways of telling these. There were ways of telling these gospels apart, even when you had them for different communities. So I don't think saying that there were other communities.
In the second century.
I'm sorry.
None of that occurred until the second. We don't have anything from the first century and even up until the mid second century. So everything that you're talking about is occurring in the mid second century and onward.
Right.
At that point,
in the
Christianity.
Second century, when we get a look at that, when we get a look at what have these different communities with these different gospels look like, they still had ways of identifying these gospels and differentiating them from each other. I mean, that's the basis of the how the arguments proceeded. So there was still a way to differentiate the gospels, even when the different communities had their own gospels. As far as Papias goes,
I feel like you didn't listen to what I said.
So let's.
I feel like
John, take some space and ask your question or make your statement clearly, and then David, go ahead.
Well, yeah, sorry, I didn't want to move past that particular part because I was afraid to forget about it. It's just that I feel like, David, you're not listening to what I said, because what I said was there would be, these individual communities. Each community would have their own gospel. There would be no need to determine which gospel was coming from which. So you'd have, if one community came into contact with another community, they would understand that both of those communities would have their own respective gospels about Jesus. Or if they didn't know that, then they would compare notes or whatever and be like, oh, this is this is their gospel, that this is our gospel. And we know this for a fact from like the Nag Hammadi library and other discoveries like that there were these several Christian groups out there that just considered it to be their particular gospel. So it wasn't until much later, when Christianity became more monolithic, then that the need for distinguishing which gospel was which was necessary.
Okay, David.
Yeah, so I'm not disagreeing that there were other different kind of factions or even Christian groups out there earlier. What I'm disagreeing with is that this implies that there wouldn't have been a practical need to tell these gospels apart. I would like to press you a little bit on Hebrews. So Hebrews is one I think we can agree is a genuinely anonymous document, right? Why is it so different in the case of Hebrews than it is from our 4 canonical Gospels? Why is it that we get disagreement over the Epistle to the Hebrews? We have anonymous copies of it, and then we find it attributed to like 4 or 5 different people in the 2nd century. When it comes to the Gospels, we get a unanimous testimony, and we possess no anonymous copies.
I lost you on that last part. Unanimous what?
Yeah, so why is it that in the case of Hebrews we have anonymous copies and disagreement over who authored it, whereas in the case of the Gospels we get a unanimous testimony on who authored them and we have no anonymous copies?
Well, I mean, as far as unanimous testimony on who authored them, like I pointed out with Papias, he has a totally different Matthew, so I don't know what you mean by unanimous agreement about who wrote what. Plus, as far as the 2nd century goes, we don't actually have like which documents they considered to be, the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Like we don't have any. We might have some citations or something. I can't remember exactly, but the first indication that we get of all 4 of these gospels being considered the 4 gospels is Marcion in the 2nd century. So like late 2nd century. Before that, we do have people mentioning certain names, but not all 4 names together. And so it kind of seems to me like in the 2nd century, there was this sort of period where they were trying to organize their ideas about these gospels. And it wasn't until Marcion just finally, hit his gavel or whatever and decided which were the 4 and which were the 4 that were the official ones or whatever. But as far as like Hebrews goes, I don't know why we're comparing Hebrews to the Gospels, other than you're trying to suggest that if the Gospels were truly anonymous, then they would look more like Hebrews. But I just don't see. I see that as a non sequitur. I don't see the value in doing that. What we do know about the Gospels is that the internal evidence for the Gospels, we don't see any kind of indication of authorship, and external to the Gospels, we only get like claims of authorship on into the 2nd century. So, I mean, while I can't say from direct evidence whether or not the titles were affixed there from the beginning, because we don't have the original manuscripts, all of the information concerning the titles and the Gospels and them being affixed to one another seems to point away from the titles being there from the start, because I feel like if they were there from the start, then it would have been as solidly transcribed as the rest of the gospel was, and that's just not true, because we have several actual pieces of evidence where the titles are actually constructed in different ways. And so, I mean, that seems to suggest that it was a little bit more lenient with the titles, which suggests that that they were transfixed later by scribes. And this isn't my opinion, by the way. Like, I'm not just coming up with this. I'm not pulling it out of my butt or anything like that. This is, coming from textual critics like Bart Ehrman, as well as the wider biblical scholar community.
Yeah, I wasn't disagreeing that you have some differences in how the titles are worded. The point is that on who the authors are, there's complete agreement on that. And so the point I was just making is that doesn't look like, that doesn't match up well with what we know about anonymous documents. Known anonymous documents such as Hebrews have a very different pedigree than the Gospels. As far as Papias goes, I'm curious if you're at all familiar with scholars like Robert Gundry, Bernard Orchard, Jay Kurtzinger, who've argued that this is actually a misunderstanding of Papias, that he's not saying that this is a Hebrew language that Matthew wrote in, but that it's actually should be best understood as saying that Matthew wrote in a Hebrew style. Are you familiar with that at all?
I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with it, but it just seems to be like an ad hoc explanation without any kind of evidence to suggest it. They
argue for it on the basis of context.
Well, I would think that would be a very small minority of people that would probably appeal to that, right?
It's not the mainstream. Yeah, I mean, I think probably more scholars than not that I read think that Papias is saying Hebrew. Think that Papias is saying Hebrew language here, but most of them, I don't see them interact with the arguments that people like Gundry and Orchard and Kurtzinger give for understanding Papias is saying Hebrew style here. My only point was is that it's less than cut and dried that Papias is in fact saying that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. I don't think it's a big deal, even if he was, but I was just saying that that's not completely certain, actually, from the text of Papias. It could be saying Hebrew style, and I just don't think it's controversial that our Gospel of Matthew is the most Hebrew in style.
I mean, I'm not a textual critic or anything like that.
That's fair. Really I was just saying, if those scholars are correct, then do you think that would, at any rate, perhaps make you view Papias in a better light if he's not saying that Matthew was written in the Hebrew language?
Well, no, because I mean, like with Papias, it's not that like that's just one aspect of Papias that's really sus. Like, for instance, Papias normally attributes a lot of his stuff as coming from this elder John, who we have no idea who it is. For all we know, it could just be some made up person that he affixed to his information to make it seem more credible. But Papias is also known to pass off hearsay as being just fact. One example of this is the death of Judas. Do you recall what Papias says about the death of Judas?
Yeah, it gives this. I actually laughed the first time I read it. Maybe for the audience who isn't familiar with it, there's this interesting description that we get of Judas it's attributed to Papias. We actually have it in two sources, to my understanding, and they actually quote him differently, so we're not completely sure what Papias actually said, but he basically says that in one source it just says that Judas is really fat and that he was lacked hygiene. The other one says that, but then it like also says that like his genitals like grew really huge and like he would pee out like bugs and pus and stuff. Maggots. So it like exaggerates it more and more. And so, the argument that people like Richard Carrier and such have made is that, so this means that Papias is not reliable. I think it's important. We don't have the full context.
I'm sorry. Can I stop you right there? Because that's not a Richard Carrier argument. It's not a Richard Carrier argument. That's that's what Bart Ehrman says, like in his book. I believe it's Jesus Interrupted.
Jesus Before the Gospels.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought it might have occurred in Jesus Interrupted too.
It might be in that one as well.
Yeah. So, but my point is that Papias isn't the most reliable, and I do think that you have to take a critical look at what Papias says. But as far as I understand it, Papias is seen as the least the least trustworthy early church father. So I mean, but still, I want to circle back around to this whole bodily resurrection thing, because we've been really harping on like the Gospels, which I know that you place a lot of emphasis on, and I didn't put a lot of emphasis on. But I mean, I get that you think that that people that witnessed these things happen wrote the Gospels, but I don't think that there's good evidence like at all in the Gospels or in Paul's work, which Paul actually wrote before the Gospels were written. There's nothing in there that actually can be shown to be a historical source for the resurrection. Even the resurrection accounts in the Gospels themselves differ wildly. And so it kind of seems like for each author, they had a different reason to change each, resurrection story in order to, prolong it. Each gospel prolongs this the period after the resurrection and what Jesus did. So, regardless of the gospel, like I guess authorship aside, I still think that there was just a mere belief in these things that occurred. And I'm wondering if you can differentiate between just the mere belief arising and it actually happening.
Okay, so 3 points on that. So first of all, when it comes to just to finish off the point about Papias and Judas, as I said, we do have two different quotations of Papias on that point. One of them is not quite as exaggerated as the other one, so we don't actually know what Papias said about Judas in that case. As far as his source there goes, it's pretty clear he's just putting a rumor that came out about Judas forward. He's not necessarily saying that this is actually what happened. Whereas in the case of the Gospels, like he's saying that he got this information from the presbyter John, who I would argue is the Apostle John. In fact, nobody questioned that until Eusebius. On the topic of the Gospels, giving us different accounts of Jesus' resurrection, and saying that they add more, well, that I think presupposes that Mark is the first one written. The chronology that I would propose is that it's Matthew first, then Luke, then Mark. So I don't think we actually have this gradual evolution. And, we don't have to get all the way into the synoptic problem. But suffice to say, if one doesn't accept kind of that chronology of the synoptics, then we don't have this slow evolution, growing there. And then the last thing that you had asked me, I forgot the last thing that you had brought up. What was the last point that you had asked me about?
So I just asked how would you distinguish a mere belief arising about that Jesus bodily resurrected and an actual bodily resurrection? Because even if let's say that the people that actually witnessed Jesus, was part of Jesus's ministry and everything like that on earth, let's say that those people are the ones that wrote the Gospels. I mean, from what it seems to me, the earliest reference to Jesus is Paul, and Paul only ever cites Scripture and Revelation as even knowing about these things. And then you do have references to other like rather unknown gospels. Like I believe Ignatius in the 2nd century refers to a gospel where Jesus just appears as this bright star in the sky, and nobody knew about his suffering and death and everything like that until he resurrected later. And Paul even gives us this indication that nobody knew about Jesus until Jesus was like revealed to people. As far as like not Jesus the historical figure, but Jesus the resurrected Jesus. Nobody knew about it until Revelation or these apostles read the Scriptures and found the resurrection of Jesus in the Scriptures. So it seems to me like mere belief is far more likely than actual bodily resurrection. So I'm sorry. I know I'm taking a long time to answer what you asked. I'm so sorry about that. Just differentiate between mere belief arising and actual bodily resurrection.
Yeah, I think you got to look at the reasons that the people who believe in it give for it. And so, I mean, in some cases, it could have been mere belief, right? But in the case of the witnesses that I'm interested in, which is particularly going to be the authors of the Gospels, the reason that they believe, the stated reason for why they believe, is these experiences that they have of the resurrected Jesus. And so I think when we take a look at the details of these accounts in the Gospels, these are not the sorts of things that can be explained away as being hallucinations or legendary development. And so if those sorts of things are ruled out, then I would say, okay, so this is not mere belief, then this is mere belief accompanied by an experience which is corroborated by multiple sources. So that's how I would differentiate between a mere belief, as I would say this belief is accompanied by a veridical experience of the risen Christ.
Well, so I would push back on the whole multiple sources thing because, I mean, I hate to keep going back to the Gospels, but I know so much of your case rests on the Gospels relaying accurate historical information. But I don't understand why you would consider all four Gospels to be independent of each other when we know that in some form or in some arrangement or another, one copied from another, and so on and so forth. So there was, regardless of who you want to put first, which I have a problem with Matthew being first, but regardless of that, there was a gospel that was first written, and then somebody else wrote a gospel and copied from that gospel, and then somebody else wrote a gospel and copied from the previous two gospels, and then the last gospel, which I think we would probably both agree is John, that one copied from all three gospels, or at least was influenced by all three gospels when he wrote his. And so when we're looking at historical sourcing, like when you see historians do source criticism, if you have one source and then you have another source written later that uses that previous source, you don't have two sources. You just have one source. So you can't say that the four gospels are four independent accounts because they all stem off of one gospel.
So I want to make a distinction between literary dependence and source dependence. So it is possible to have literary dependence without source dependence. So I acknowledge literary dependence among the three synoptic gospels. But each synoptic gospel also has independent information that is not found in the other ones. And that information still has to be explained, right? So in my view, Matthew's going to be the first one written. His information comes from him being an eyewitness. Luke's going to be the next one written. Luke is not an eyewitness. What does he say in the preface of his, or in the prologue of his gospel? He says that he got his information from eyewitnesses. It makes sense that he would use Matthew in that case then, if Matthew is an eyewitness. In fact, if we can independently justify the idea that Matthew is an eyewitness, as I think we can, then that gives us reason to believe Luke when he says that he's getting his information from eyewitnesses. As it pertains to the resurrection of Jesus, he is not dependent on Matthew. So if we can justify that he got his information from eyewitnesses in the case of Matthew, then I think we have good reason for thinking that he also probably got his information from eyewitnesses when it comes to the resurrection, both because that's what he says and that because of his known dependence on Matthew. In the case of Mark, I think we can justify that Mark got his information from Peter, and he also obviously uses both Matthew and Luke, which, again, I don't have a problem with that. John is not literarily dependent on any of them. He may have known them, possibly not. There's debate about that, but we don't have verbatim agreements in John. So John is clearly independent of the synoptics.
Hey, real quick, guys, before you come back on that, John, I just wanted to say we've got 10 minutes until we're going to go to some closing statements and then audience Q&A. And I know that the Gospels, the issue of the Gospels, is obviously vitally important to this whole discussion. And so, but if there's anything else that we need to work in here to make the case or against the case for the resurrection, I just want to say this is the 10 minutes to do it in.
We'll let John bring up an issue because I originally kicked us off on the Gospels, and so I want him to have a chance to, press me on some issues that maybe he wanted to raise.
Right. Well, it's kind of there's we have spent the most of the time discussing the Gospels, and I would love to know how you actually can substantiate that John didn't use the other Gospels when it's very obvious that John reified Luke's Lazarus into actual history. I wonder how you explain that, but maybe we can touch on that some other time. So in my view of it, Paul and the Gospels, because you say that the Gospels could have had these independent sources behind them or whatnot, which honestly just kind of seems like ad hoc, claims to things. But it seems to me like the common source for all of it is the Scriptures. Like I have in my presentation, you've got Paul all over the place claiming that Scriptures are where he finds that Christ died for sins and that he resurrected. Those are specifically Paul cites the Scriptures as where he learned those things. And then in the Gospels, especially Matthew, you have references to Scriptures everywhere saying that, oh, Jesus did this because the Scripture said this. And so it seems like the ultimate source, however you go about it, are the Scriptures. So that seems to lead me in the direction of, well, the Scriptures are the ultimate source. And so if people were reinterpreting the Scriptures like we know them to be doing, then that prepped people for the mere belief arising. Then it just takes somebody like Peter claiming that Jesus resurrected and came to him in a vision for people to start believing in this thing. And I'm just kind of curious, other than you thinking that the apostles writing the Gospels, or the disciples rather writing the Gospels, what do you have any other evidence that would say that it's more likely Jesus resurrected bodily from the dead over the mere belief arising? Like, is there any other evidence that you have?
Yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't able to kind of get into a lot of the positive reasons that I have for believing the Gospels. But I mean, yeah, I would adduce things like undesigned coincidences and unexplained illusions. But here's one that I think is relevant to the point that you just raised, and this would be the argument from awkwardly fulfilled prophecies. So you point out that Matthew, for example, I mean, it's clearly part of his purpose, right, to prove that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and he uses the Scriptures a lot to do this. The issue is that he seems to force things a lot, right? Like he has to force the Scripture, like, I called my son out of Egypt, which doesn't seem prophetic at all, right? Like in the original context in the Old Testament, this is talking about the Jews coming out of Egypt, and yet Matthew takes that and tries to say that this is predicting Jesus coming out of Egypt. So I'm just curious, what it seems to me that this argues for the actuality of that event having happened, because otherwise, why would he be trying to scour the Old Testament to find some reference that he could plug in here?
Well, so Matthew's gospel, one of the things that it tries to do is it tries to present Jesus as this new Moses. And so that's why you have so many calls to Egypt and so many interpretations of Scripture and interpretations that seem to do the things that you're thinking about. That Matthew's community saw Jesus as the new Moses, on top of the new Elijah, the new Elisha, and all this other stuff. Obviously John was I think John was Elisha. Anyways, one of the two. But in any case, Matthew's gospel sees Jesus as the new Moses. So they're trying to present him as the new Moses, so they make these allusions back to Moses' story. That's why, for instance, in Matthew's gospel, you have Jesus's family after Jesus's birth. They have to flee to Egypt, and this is because of Herod who wants to kill all the Jewish children. They flee to Egypt. And this is similar in fashion to what happens with Moses. The Pharaoh in Egypt is wanting to kill all the Jewish children because of a prophecy that he heard. And so Moses' mom puts him in a wicker basket, sends him down the river, and Moses just ends up in Egypt anyways, being part of the royal family, actually. And so, I mean, they're trying to mirror that with Jesus there. And it's all done to make Jesus look like the new Moses.
Okay, so your explanation, awkwardly fulfilled prophecy, is to be explained by recourse to this kind of Moses archetype. That's how you'd answer that argument.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's very obvious in the Matthew gospel that he's figured as, the new Moses. I mean, I don't really think that that's controversial. So yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's how I would explain their interpretation of scripture, is that they see him as the new Moses.
Okay, I'd have to think about that answer on that particular one, but yeah. I mean, I think other evidences for the internal evidence for the reliability of the Gospels comes again from undesigned coincidences and unexplained delusions and things like that. And again, I didn't want this to be
so I know I figured that undesigned coincidences might come up, but I'm wondering, do you understand why I wouldn't find that compelling, like the undesigned coincidences, considering how I view the Gospel's development?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I'm not sure if I've heard you in particular explain kind of your understanding of undesigned coincidences.
Okay. Well, I mean, so basically, regardless of which gospel was first, we can disagree on that. But you got one gospel that's written, and then you got another gospel that uses that gospel to write its story. I mean, you can't say that there are undesigned coincidences between the two, because obviously the second person that copied from the first person is going to construct their narrative in order to fit like a puzzle into that narrative. Like, they're going to explain some different things, they're going to say some different things, but they're going to make sure that, it's still somewhat cohesive, because they're copying from that first person. And then you bring in the third person who's going to have to fit his puzzle piece in with the other two. And so that makes these undesigned coincidences actually designed coincidences. So, I mean, they're planned out.
I think that misses the point that these are casual things, but I also think that that's in conflict with people who want to say that that the Gospels are contradicting themselves, right? If you're going to say, well, of course they're trying to make it cohesive, then you suddenly have a problem if you want to, press contradictions. I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can say that these are contradictory accounts written for different communities with different purposes that are trying to correct one another, while at the same time saying that, oh, well, they're paying attention to these very subtle details, and so they're going to make their gospel interlock with that. I think those are mutually incompatible positions to take on the Gospels.
Well, I don't think so, because when you have one author that is trying to correct another author, at that point they're not trying to they're not trying to fit their puzzle piece into the other gospel. They're changing like the puzzle piece, right? And that since we're using puzzle pieces like this abstract idea of what an undesigned coincidence is, they're changing their puzzle piece for that particular situation. But I mean, that doesn't describe like all like that that doesn't describe all of the gospels or all the content of the gospels. There are times where they're trying to make the information fit with what people already know about these things. So like one of the popular undesigned coincidences is the feeding of the 5,000, right? Talking about there's different small details in each gospel, but each gospel has in common this feeding of the 5,000. Mark has two feedings, which are kind of awkward, but since each gospel is trying to have this same event happen, they're obviously going to recite information that seems to fit with these other gospels, or at least seem to mimic it. And so I feel like these being actually designed coincidences is much more likely than this undesigned coincidence. And I don't think that can, even if they were undesigned coincidences, I don't think that gets us back to eyewitnesses.
We're at about 45 minutes. Do you guys want to take another few minutes on this, or are you ready to go to closing statements?
There's so much that we could hash out here. So I don't know if David has any more specific questions for me. I'm fine going to like sort of summarizing each of our cases, but I'll leave that up to David.
No, we can move into summary if you're all right with that.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to put it full screen on Dave, I don't know who should go first. There's no bias in this choice. I'm just going to throw David up there. And David, you make your closing statements, and then we'll go to John if everybody's okay with that.
All right. Yeah. So
I've told everyone they can have up to 5 minutes. So bear that in mind.
All right. Yeah, I don't have anything prepared in the way of a closing statement. Just to summarize, some of the thoughts I have is I do think that we haven't seen any real evidence to think that the Gospels are or ever were anonymous. Again, we can use Hebrews as a test case. We can see what genuinely anonymous documents look like, and that's just not what we have in the case of the Gospels. I think we have good reason for thinking that Matthew and John, at least, are eyewitness accounts, and that Luke and Mark are very closely related to them. As far as this point about differentiating, just a belief from the resurrection actually happening, again, the answer there is you look at the reasons. You look at why is this belief there? And if we look at the Gospels, it's because there are these experiences of the bodily resurrected Christ. And so if we take those seriously, as I have argued that we should, then that's how we're very easily able to differentiate mere belief in the resurrection from true belief in the resurrection. Let's see, a few other points here. I don't think that Jesus is going to be analogous to things like Romulus and Osiris and Zalmoxis. We don't have any eyewitness accounts that can be corroborated for these particular individuals and their resurrections, even if I granted, for the sake of argument, that they were in any way analogous to the resurrection of Jesus. And I don't actually think that you can make the case that they are. But again, even if they were, they just don't have the quality of evidence that something like the resurrection of Jesus has for it. On the prior probability issue for the resurrection of Jesus, I feel like it's begging the question to say that this has never happened before, because it begs the question against a lot of other resurrections in the Bible and things like that. I don't know that we could put the prior probability on that at near zero. It seems like from an agnostic point of view, we would just have to say that the prior probability on something like that is inscrutable. Certainly, we could say that it's rare and unlikely, so maybe we could put a lower prior probability on it, but lower prior probabilities can always be overcome by sufficient evidence, which I think we have in the case of the Gospels. I don't think a miracle is going to require a suspension of reality. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it seems to assume that God is not part of reality. To the extent that we accept that he is, then it wouldn't be correct to identify a miracle as a suspension of reality. This other issue about the Gospels being based on one another, again, literary dependence is compatible with source independence. All of the Gospels have unique information to them. That's got to be explained somehow. And I don't see why that's ad hoc. We need an explanation for how they got this information. Again, in the case of Luke, he says this information is from eyewitnesses. Mark's unique information, granted, he doesn't really tell us where it's from, but if we take the early church seriously, we can see that these were people who were wanting the teachings of Peter from Mark. And so they would have known that Peter was the source behind this. And then Mark just later, because of the Petrine authority there, later got adopted into the Christian community at large. So I think that it wasn't really necessary for him to identify his sources because, if the church history is right on this, then the original recipients of Mark's gospel, they just knew that Peter was the source behind this information. I believe that John does identify himself later on in his gospel. So I don't think there's any case for anonymity there. I think that's all I really got in the way of concluding thoughts there. So I'll turn it over to John.
All right, thanks. And John, we'll let you take your closing remarks now.
Well, I really appreciate being invited on to Trinity Radio here, and like Braxton said at the very beginning, we've had a very friendly connection. And I'm so happy for that. Thank you so much for that, Braxton. As far as my case goes, I'm still not convinced of the resurrection. Obviously, sorry to burst anybody's bubble that thought that I might come away as a Christian tonight. But I come at this from a very analytical point of view, and I look at the prior probability first, which what I said was that it's extremely unlikely, not that it's 0%, because I wouldn't choose 0% or impossible. I would say that it's extremely unlikely that Jesus would have bodily resurrected, and that it's far more likely that a mere belief would have risen. And then once we start looking at the evidence for that, all we find are scriptures and visions being referred to. And then, of course, the main topic of tonight was the Gospels. And I don't consider them to be able to give us good information, primarily because we don't know who wrote them. We don't have the original texts of these, so we don't know how they were originally circulated. But what we do know is that the titles were affixed to them later, and even the four Gospels were only agreed upon by Marcion. And so, given all of that information, it does not counter-react the prior probability for me. This information about the Gospels, I feel like it cannot surpass the prior probability because the Gospels are based on the Scriptures. And I get that we didn't have a lot of time to cover like undesigned coincidences or some of these finer topics, but I don't think that undesigned coincidences can get us to a bodily resurrection. I think that it can get us to mere belief arising. I feel like it can get us to this idea of the Jews were reinterpreting scripture in order to create this new religion of Christianity in a way where historical figure or not doesn't really matter. I mean, like I said, considering Jesus as a historical figure, taking some person who did die and then piling legends onto him based on the scriptures. I feel like that's far more likely than a bodily resurrection. But that's just coming at it from a strictly analytical point of view of weighing the evidence that we actually have and trying to reduce the ad hoc claims that are presented. I feel like my case for the mere belief arising has far less ad hoc and arbitrary claims associated with my information. So I feel like it's probably the most likely one to be correct. And so I didn't come here to convince anybody, just to put forth a good case. I don't know if I did that, but I appreciate being given the opportunity. So thank you, Braxton. Thank you, David. And I guess that'll be it for me.